I would like to welcome everyone to Mtri's 2022 Summer Seminar Series. Each week in July and August, we will be hosting a talk on the biodiversity and conservation of Gaspowick, Southwest Nova Scotia. My name is Morgan Snare, and I'm a summer research assistant here at the Mersey-Tobiatic Research Institute. But before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that Mtri is in, and we are meeting from Gaspowick, one of the 7 districts of Mi'kmaq, homeland of the Mi'kmaq people. We acknowledge the treaties of peace and friendship, and we thank the Mi'kmaq people for their generosity in sharing their homeland with us. Tonight, I'm very pleased to introduce Chad Simmons. Chad is an ecologist here at Mtri and has been with us for over 2 years. Next, I'll hand the seminar over to Chad, but I would like to remind everyone to please keep your mics muted, and if you have any questions during the talk, please type them in the chat window. With that, Chad, it's all yours.
Great. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Morgan. It's a pleasure to be on this side of the seminar. Usually I'm behind the scenes and facilitating, but tonight I'll be presenting. And as Morgan said, my name is Chad Simmons, and I'm an ecologist here at the Mersey-Tobiatic Research Institute. And I lead Mtri's wetland work, as well as some of our outreach projects. Oh. There we go. So tonight I'm going to be focusing on my work at Mtri and walking you through, in what is my opinion, the most amazing ecosystems in Nova Scotia, wetlands. So most of us already have a pretty good idea about what a wetland is, even though we may not be able to give a precise scientific definition. So wetlands are, of course, wet. Most wetlands are at least soggy, if not flooded, for much of the year. And if you're standing in one, chances are pretty good that you're getting your feet pretty soaked. So in science, we like to have official structured definitions. And for a wetland, that is ecosystems such as marshes, swamps, fens, or bogs that either periodically or are permanently have water levels near or close to the surface, and they sustain aquatic processes as indicated by the presence of poorly drained soils, water-loving plants, and biological activities adapted to wet conditions. But sometimes in a wetland, the water is not super obvious. For some wetlands, like vernal pools, they dry out in summer and may not be filled up again until the fall or even next year. And many of our forested wetlands and floodplains around rivers can be relatively dry for much of the year and look like traditional upland drier forests. The size of wetlands can also vary quite a bit, from tiny ponds to giant peatlands that stretch for kilometers. And a major problem with wetlands, especially when you're trying to map them out, is that they can have blurry borders. So there's usually not a firm line where on one side is clearly the wetland and on the other side is clearly a forest or a lake. They have gradual patterns and transition into other ecosystem types like a forest or waterway. So really the one consistent thing about wetlands is that they're always changing. Visiting a wetland from week to week and season to season, you'll see difference or personalities, as I like to call them, and that make up their overall character. So they can have changing degrees of sogginess, different kinds of plants that flower at different times of year, or different animal species that are breeding or looking for food or hibernating there. It's this variable nature of wetlands that makes them especially interesting places to visit throughout the year, but it also makes them particularly tricky to pin down with precise definitions. So because of their tendency to bog people down, the incredibly important ecological value associated with wetlands has often been overlooked. So the European-dominated mindset that arrived in Nova Scotia a few centuries ago saw wetlands more or less as wastelands, needing to be filled, cut, and converted into more productive farmland. And this practice was likely extensive, although it's hard to kind of pinpoint exactly how extensive. We know, at least with salt marshes, it was roughly half of all wetlands were converted into other uses, mostly agricultural. And the fact is, we don't really know how many wetlands have been lost. Of course, today, with all of our modern understanding, we realize that wetlands perform many important functions and services in our landscape. So this can include things like improving water quality, controlling floods and drought, recharging groundwater, protecting coastal infrastructure from erosion, locking away carbon, and providing critical habitat for many species, including rare species and species at risk. Wetlands are among the most productive and diverse of all ecosystems on Earth, So the loss of wetlands can mean the loss of species or local wildlife populations, and the plants that depend on them for habitat or food. And because of many of Nova Scotia's wetlands have already been lost due to us humans running amok, the wetlands that do remain take on even more importance. And this is a fun little fact that I learned in prepping for this presentation. Nova Scotia wetlands provide an estimated $7.9 billion worth of benefits in ecosystem services. So that's like the water filtration, flood prevention, drought prevention, to Nova Scotia's economy every year. And if you make a quick comparison to other prominent industries, such as forestry, that industry generates about $700 million to Nova Scotia's GDP and about $1 billion to our trading. So wetlands are roughly double or 8 times as more economically valuable as forestry. So there's really no doubt about it. Nova Scotia is rich in wetlands, and based on the 2004 wetland inventory, Nova Scotia has just under 400,000 hectares, which is roughly 7% of our land area, of freshwater wetlands, and just over 17,000 hectares of salt marshes. So the most dominant type of wetland that we have in this province are peatlands. So this is bogs and fens. The next most common are shrub swamps and salt marshes. And our rarest types are freshwater marshes, lakeshore wetlands, wet meadows, and floodplains along rivers. Each of these different types of wetlands function somewhat differently and support a unique array of plants and wildlife. Because there's a variety of wetland types present in Nova Scotia that differ quite a bit in their appearance and their location in the landscape, it can be really tricky to know what someone's talking about when they just say wetland. So I wanted to go through some of the major types. And unsurprisingly, from this slide, you can see bogs are one type of wetland. They're known for their peat or sphagnum moss that they support. And in the lower right-hand corner, you can see a zoomed-in picture of sphagnum moss. It's very easy to identify because it's star-shaped from when you look down on it. And it's adapted very well to soggy conditions in wetlands. So the ground of bogs is really unaffected by precipitation because it's basically a giant sponge of moss that just soaks up any water that gets into the ecosystem. Bogs are mainly fed through precipitation, fog, and snowmelt. And they generally are pretty low in nutrients and high in acidity. So they generally have a pH of around 4, which is somewhat equivalent to a can of pop. They can be treed, usually by black spruce or tamarack, otherwise called larch, or they can be treeless and they're just covered in moss and shrubs such as leatherleaf, huckleberry, lambkill, and Labrador tea. They can also have shorter woody species such as cranberry or crowberry. Herbaceous plants such as pitcher plants and cotton grass are also common. Fens are very similar to bogs. They're dominated by the peat moss, but they're usually fed by streams and rivers and not just precipitation. So marshes are a little bit more dramatic. Their water levels can fluctuate daily, seasonally, or yearly, and they occasionally dry up, exposing their soils. So instead of being fed by precipitation like bogs and fens, they more often get their water from runoff, streams, storm surges, the groundwater, and tides. Their high nutrients support lots of plant life and a faster decomposition rate. So as plants grow and die, their nutrients are released by microorganisms, and that in turn supports even more plant life. And this is why we often see many grass species dominating marshlands. Some marshes don't have a high level of decomposition because they either dry up or a tide will move in and flush all of the loose topsoil away. But more stable marshes, like those found on lake shores, can accumulate thick, rich organic layers in the soil. And this is a picture of me in the field, and you can see I have a soil sample here, and this whole thing is just rich organic matter. So it's not like the traditional soil you often see in your backyard or your garden that has clay or sand or silt. This is all just dead plant matter that's been building up over decades and hundreds of years. And this is why marshes are one of the best at sequestering carbon. So as the plants grow and absorb carbon dioxide, they die, they get buried, And because these ecosystems are so wet, they don't break down like they traditionally would. It's just too wet for a lot of microorganisms. So they just continue building up and storing away that carbon. Salt marshes are a special subset of marshes that are regularly flooded by salt water or salt spray. And they're extremely productive wetlands that provide many critical environmental, societal, and economic functions and services. Their rich soils are why they've been targeted so much for diking to create farmlands, especially in the Annapolis Valley. So in my opinion, forested wetlands or swamps are some of the best types of wetlands. And that's probably because I work mostly on these types of wetlands. And they're often dominated by trees and shrubs. Their soils are usually wood-rich, unsurprisingly, because of all the woody plants that grow in them, or they can be mineral soils. And the water table is usually near the surface, and they can be seasonally or permanently flooded, although generally they are not as wet as marshes, fens, and open bogs. They're common along drier portions of floodplains and riparian areas of rivers and streams. They have varying amounts of nutrients, and their waters can be acidic or neutral or somewhere in between. It really depends on the specifics of that site. In shrub swamps, unsurprisingly, shrubs, like alders, tend to dominate, with grass-like species as the typical ground cover. But in wooded swamps, trees dominate, and there are usually several other layers of vegetation, including shrubs, ferns, and a variety of herbaceous plants. So the final type of wetland that I wanted to talk about are vernal pools. And these are small, typically less than half a hectare in size. They're shallow, and they lack permanent inlets or outlets, so there's no streams flowing in or out of them. And they often dry up in the summer. And although they're very small and short-lived, they provide critical breeding habitat for frogs or salamanders, insects, and even some species of fairy shrimp, which I found really cool. They're also feeding and drinking sites for birds and mammals, turtles, and other species of wildlife. So with that, I wanted to take a little break, ask if there's any questions up to this point. And Morgan, if you're able, we should have a poll for the audience just to see what everyone's thinking about these questions.
The poll should be live now for everyone to access there.
And funny enough, Morgan, I can't actually see the results of the poll, but if you'll let me know, that'd be great.
Absolutely. We've got 60% participation right now. And so far, everyone who's answered does have a wetland on their property. Excellent. And except for one, we've got one who doesn't. That's okay. Not everyone can have a wetland, I understand. And are there any wetlands that are special to you? Most of our audience is answering yes, there is a wetland to them that they find special.
Wonderful. I'm not surprised the audience that came to the wetlands seminar are interested and passionate about wetlands.
It definitely does make sense, yeah.
I have a very biased audience and I love it. Okay, great. And we can get into that a little bit more at the end during the question period, and I can share some of the wetlands I really enjoy, and hopefully some of the audience can as well. So now that we have a little bit better understanding about what wetlands are, I thought it was important to mention the policy the province has put in place to protect these ecosystems. So in 2011, the province released the Nova Scotia Wetland Conservation Policy, and it aims to provide a direction and a framework for the conservation and management of wetlands in Nova Scotia. The policy highlights the important role that wetlands play in Nova Scotia's landscape and their value to society. And the overall goal is to manage the province's wetlands in a consistent manner to maintain a high level of wetland integrity for future generations while allowing for sustainable economic development. So overall, the policy aims to prevent the net loss of wetlands in Nova Scotia and designate certain wetlands of special significance and have no loss within these ecosystems. So not all wetlands are special significance wetlands. Those are usually just salt marshes. All wetlands that are already within a protected area, so provincial parks, wilderness areas, nature reserves, national parks as well. Or a special significance wetland can be those that support species at risk. So overall, the policy says that some wetlands, because they're either protecting a species at risk or they're in a protected area, those will have no loss. So the province really doesn't want any economic development in those wetlands. And for all other wetlands, they are hoping for no net loss, which means that if a development does come in and does alter a wetland in some way, they have to either replace it with an equal or greater area of wetland, or they have to rehabilitate the site after the development has happened and make sure that it keeps its ecological integrity. So the wetlands of special significance is one area that MTRI has been working with in the Nova Scotia Department of Environment and Climate Change to improve. As I mentioned, wetlands that support species at risk are designated as wetlands of special significance, or WSS, but the government is working to figure out exactly how to do this, especially for species that don't just stay put in a wetland. So for example, snakes and turtles, they rely on wetlands a lot, but they also use other ecosystems and they wander about doing their little turtle or snake thing. So that makes it a little challenging. What wetlands do we protect? Where do we draw that line? These are the questions the province came to us to help answer. So in the spring, we submitted our report, which included detailed procedures for incorporating a range of different species, including plants, lichens, birds, reptiles, and mammals into the WSS. For example, we recommended prioritizing wetlands with a priority plant or a lichen species. And we created these lists of priority plants and lichens by sitting down with wildlife experts. And our plant list has around 180 species of rare and ecologically valuable plants, and our lichens have around 11. So moving forward this year, we're hoping to continue working with the province to continue developing the WSS. And from our discussion, the department does seem interested in improving how it protects biodiversity and rare species in wetlands, although at the moment, we do not have a contract and we do not know if and when we will actually have a new one. So another area of wetland work and research that MTRI is working on is through the Gesbuik Conservation Collaborative, or the KCC. And the KCC is a collection of partners, including government, NGOs, and researchers focused on coordinating conservation in Gesbuik, and MTRI leads a number of the ecosystem targets. So specifically, I help manage the forested wetland target. MTRI, specifically Jane Barker and Abby Lewis, they run the forested target, and then we are also running the riparian area target. So the meeting with the forest wetlands target started in 2018, and it has worked to ID threats and barriers to forested wetland conservation. Earlier this year, we had a meeting and we developed a list of key ecological attributes for forested wetlands in Gesbuik. So these ecological attributes are aspects of an ecosystem, biology or ecology, that if missing or altered, would have a substantial effect on the ecosystem in a negative way. So basically, they're important components of an ecosystem that we want to maintain. And some of the examples of the targets that we have suggested are the extent of forested wetlands in Southwest Nova Scotia, which is kind of a no-brainer. You know, if we're going to protect wetlands, we want to protect the amount there already are. But we also highlighted the conditions and state of buffers around these ecosystems, because wetlands are so dependent on outside ecosystems because they're connected by their water or their vegetation. It's important to keep those ecosystems around them also intact. And as part of our KCC work, this year we're also developing a research site inventory and a long-term monitoring program for forested wetlands. Our site inventory is exactly what it sounds like. It's a list of forested wetland sites in Gesbuik with details about what the sites are like. So this project really came out of our KCC meetings, where we routinely heard from researchers and government officials that they're having a hard time finding appropriate sites for their projects. And this relates to another problem we have in the wetland world, in that we don't have very accurate provincial maps of wetlands. The province has been somewhat addressing this issue, and they are working to develop a new LiDAR-based wetland map, but to date, we don't have any releases, but we're hoping something comes out really soon. So at the moment, if researchers are looking for a site say they're doing a research project on the invasive glossy buckthorn species, and they want to see how that is impacting wetlands, they have to go out, they have to talk to colleagues and kind of more or less just hope they find enough sites to meet their needs and give them reasonable and valid results. And for many projects and many researchers, this has been a big roadblock to their important scientific research. So with our inventory, we're aiming to cut down that wasted time and give researchers all the details they need about particular sites. And of course, it also gives us the opportunity to go out and collect wildlife community data and get a better understanding of these ecosystems. So with our inventory, we're collecting site information from researchers, as well as going out and getting brand new site data. And we're collecting information on the conditions in and around wetlands. So is there forestry activities happening in or around the wetland? Is there agriculture? Are there roads nearby? But we're also looking at what the plant, bird, amphibian, and lichen communities are like, as well as the environmental conditions, specifically the soil, what's it made out of, how thick is its organic layer, things along that. So developing the inventory is really what I've been focusing on this summer. But later in this year, we're hoping to begin work on our long-term monitoring project with the KCC group. And it's very early to say exactly what this is going to look like because it's going to take a lot of work, and we're hoping to include a lot of researchers in that discussion so that by the end we come up with a really successful result. But we're hoping to include details about wildlife communities, including the insects, which are a very under-researched group, especially in Nova Scotia, as well as the climate. So we want to look at the temperature, the humidity, and water levels within wetlands. So long-term monitoring projects are really the gold standard in ecosystem conservation research, and they can tell us a lot about how these systems are changing over time. There's a lot of concern around forested wetlands in Southwest Nova Scotia because we expect to experience more droughts with a changing climate, and a lot of species at risk are dependent on wetlands. So if these wetlands change substantially, are we going to see the loss of already at-risk species? So having a monitoring program in place will allow us to glimpse these possible futures and also start to work to either prevent the damage or mitigate it as much as possible. So now that I've ranted at you guys for quite a while about wetlands and why I think they're great, I want to leave you with the take-home message that really wetlands, especially in my opinion, are worth their weight in gold. They offer so much to us humans and all the species we share Nova Scotia with, and I highly recommend visiting them and getting to know them better. They have many different faces, and I have really yet to see a wetland that looks very similar to one I've already been at. And at this point in my career, I've been to at least 100 different wetland sites. And if you are interested in getting to know some wetlands, I highly recommend the Ducks Unlimited Canada Treasured Wetlands. It's basically a series of wetlands, and they've produced interactive maps, so you can look up some special wetlands that are near you and go out and hike and learn about the species that are there. And if you are lucky enough to own some wetlands, I highly recommend treasuring them and doing your best not to alter them. As a society, we really need to maximize the protection of these ecosystems. So with that, thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed. And does anyone have any questions? And I'm just going to stop sharing my screen because I can't see what anyone's doing.
That's fair. Also, spent a lot of time in wetlands this summer with Mtri. Can definitely vouch. They are a very cool place, and I haven't seen nearly as many as Chad has, but I also have not seen one that looked the same as another at this point. I did have a question. So do you know right off, Chad, is there a certain type of wetland that potentially is known to provide more ecological services over another, keeping in mind that they all are very important, but is there one that you know that tends to, like a salt marsh versus a bog or something like that?
Well, it really depends on what kind of services you're talking about. If it's carbon sequestration, marshes are incredibly important. If it's water filtration and flood mitigation and drought prevention, bogs are a little bit more useful. but overall they generally share all of the service qualities. And yeah, they're all really, really, really useful. Like I said, like $8 billion in services a year from Nova Scotia. So it's quite astounding.
Definitely, thank you. Yeah, so like Chad said, if you have any questions, you can feel free to unmute yourself or put them in the chat window here.
Well, I definitely want to say thank you for putting this together, for starters. And I definitely have a wide range of questions. I'm also curious about everybody else that came to this seminar and like what their background, like the questionnaire that you threw out, like what their connections are with wetlands as well. Especially given your presentation on like the different type of wetlands and the different roles that they play. I think everyone's like story will be really interesting and unique. I guess I would start by throwing a question out, perhaps, or I could give a bit of a background in terms of like why I showed up a bit. One thing that I've been bumping into is trying to figure out who is responsible for wetlands. And to give a bit of backstory to this, I've been involved with the Eagle Head Beach. Are you familiar with that sort of community-led group that has raised a fuss?
Yes, yeah, I have heard about your group in various news articles.
Yeah, so we've actually also formed a co-op prior to that has bought some coastal properties that came up for land auction with the reversing tidal falls to try to protect that ecosystem there. But specifically with the Eagle Head project, we're really running into a question of like who is accountable for both evaluating and enforcing like what is like reasonable developments and like encroachment upon, or even like assessing like what's valuable. And it seems like everybody kind of defers to everybody else, and so that nobody has to deal with it.
So at the end of the day, the Department of Environment and Climate Change is the one that handles wetlands. But depending on who owns the property, you'll have different kind of guiding principles. So Nova Scotia's wetland policy really only applies to Crown-owned wetlands. And then with privately owned land, if you are to alter or develop a wetland, you have to get a permit. That process is through the Department of Environment and Climate Change. As to what they consider like inappropriate development, I don't really know. I haven't had any direct experience with that. But yeah, that's kind of the extent to my knowledge as far as development wise.
Yeah, that answered my question. I'm just also curious in like, with the sort of establishing wetlands and monitoring wetlands, how that kind of overlaps with sort of enforcement a little bit, like whether there are preemptive things to try to like really establish which wetlands matter and how, as opposed to coming in after the fact and enforcing those a little bit.
That's a great question. Of enforcement, it's an area that Nova Scotia could easily improve upon. I know from firsthand experience that there is a lot of development that happens without permits, especially on private land. And the province does not have the capabilities to enforce all of that, unfortunately. The situation changes a lot if the wetland has a species at risk on it. And roughly 2/3 of our species at risk in the province are dependent on wetlands. So we tend to see a lot of them in wetlands, even though they're rare overall. But if you can find a species at risk, that will substantially slow or permanently block any development for obvious reasons. We don't want to, kill the birds that are endangered or any other wildlife. Yeah, other than that though, I don't know. I don't think the province has any value. It doesn't put any values on wetlands if they're, say, really good at sequestering carbon or water filtration, even though I think they should. In saying that though, the province does support the really incredibly invaluable salt marshes. So you're not allowed to develop any salt marshes in the province. But outside of those, I don't think. And I have, if anyone wants any follow-up information, or feel free to just ask me to look into things, I'd love to. Wetlands are kind of my passion. So you can feel free to give me an email anytime, and I'll try to help as much as I can and answer any and all questions. So thank you, Joshua.
Thanks for the answer. Yeah, no, it's good to hear those things, and I'm sure I'll follow up with.
Great. Does anyone else have any questions? Oh, I'm seeing one over Facebook that says, does Mtri have a bibliography library of all the Nova Scotia local wetland research to share? Ooh, great question, Katie. No. Unfortunately, we don't have a little collection of interesting wetland research. Although it's a good idea, I might have to spend some time this winter collecting a few things.
Great. I've got a question in the chat from Carter. What are some indicators that wetlands are under stress?
Great question. It depends a lot on the type of wetland. So say, for instance, if it's a marsh or a fen, which has like clear water inputs and outputs, we can see changes in the nutrient levels. We can also see vegetation is also a very significant ecological indicator. If we're seeing the community shifting, that could be an indication that nutrients are changing or the hydrology is changing. So generally when someone does a wetland assessment before or after development, they will look at things like the hydrology. Has the water table changed before and after? Has the vegetation changed? Has the nutrients in the open water changed? Has it gone up? Has it gone down? And invasive species are another good indicator that an ecosystem is under stress. No problem, Carter. Thanks for coming.
Great, thank you. Are you seeing any questions at this time over on Facebook as well, Chad? Or
nope, just the one.
Awesome. Okay, well, if we do get any more, Chad's email is in the chat. I'm not sure, is it also in the Facebook chat? If not, I can read it out, but.
No, but I'll put it there.
Okay, perfect. Chad's gonna put that in the Facebook chat there for if you have any questions, you can feel free to email him. As he said, wetlands are definitely his passion, so. And I just wanted to say thank you again, Chad, for this presentation, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. This was our last summer seminar, and we hope you enjoyed it, and you can join us in the fall for the start of our monthly Sit Back seminar series that starts in late September. I would like to thank the Region of Queens for supporting us in our seminar series. As always, you can stay up to date with our seminars by following us on Facebook, and if you would like to watch tonight's seminar again, you can check it out on our Facebook Live or visit our YouTube channel. We hope everyone stays well and we get to see you all again very, very soon. So thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Morgan. Today is Morgan's last day with Mtri. She's going back to school, and I just want to thank her for a whole summer of excellent seminar facilitating. Great questions, wonderful attitude. We wish her all the best.
Thank you. Thank you. It was an amazing summer.